The tension in the cabin was unbearable, the entire plane holding its breath as Danielle slowly revealed her FAA director badge. Lisa's face turned pale, the shift in power instantaneous. The murmurs rippled through the cabin as passengers, once passive, now watched with wide eyes. Lisa stumbled over her words, realizing she had misjudged the situation. Misjudged Danielle. The flight attendant's authority cracked, her smugness replaced with uncertainty. Danielle stood her ground, her voice unwavering, asserting her rightful place in the first-class seat. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to hit subscribe and share this video with your friends. Let's continue this important conversation. The massive glass panels of Chicago O'Hare International Airport reflected the deep orange hues of the setting sun as weary travelers hurried through its sprawling terminals. The constant hum of conversations blended with the crisp announcements echoing overhead, directing passengers to their gates. Business people in tailored suits tapped urgently at their phones, while families herded children past busy cafes and last-minute souvenir shops. The air carried a mix of freshly brewed coffee, jet fuel, and the occasional scent of someone's fast food meal. At Gate C-27, the boarding area for Flight 1974 to San Francisco, a diverse crowd had already gathered. Some passengers sat in stiff rows of chairs, scrolling through their devices, while others stood, shifting impatiently as they waited for the boarding call. A few first-class travelers, distinguished by their designer carry-ons and confident postures, hovered near the priority boarding lane. A woman in a sleek navy pantsuit approached the gate with measured, confident strides. She was poised, powerful, and unmistakably self-assured. Yet, despite her calm exterior, the exhaustion clung to her like an invisible weight. She wasn't just any passenger. She was Danielle Carter, a director at the Federal Aviation Administration. And though she didn't know it yet, she was about to become the center of an incident that would shake the entire flight. Danielle Carter had spent her entire career ensuring that the skies were safe. At 43 years old, she had built a reputation as one of the most respected aviation regulators in the industry. As a director at the FAA, she played a critical role in drafting policies that shaped airline safety, crew regulations, and passenger rights. She had faced airline executives, government officials, and industry lobbyists with unshakable poise, ensuring that efficiency never came at the expense of safety. But despite her impressive credentials, Danielle was exhausted. The last 3 days have been a whirlwind of back-to-back meetings, panel discussions, and regulatory debates in Washington, D.C. She had barely caught a few hours of sleep before boarding a flight to Chicago for another round of aviation policy briefings. Now, she was finally heading home to San Francisco, desperate for just a few hours of peace before diving back into work. As she reached the boarding gate, she adjusted the shoulder strap of her leather laptop bag, rolling her stiff neck. Her dark brown eyes, sharp yet warm, took in the scene with quiet observation. She had been in airports more times than she could count. But there was something about O'Hare's chaotic energy that always made her feel like she was moving through a living, breathing machine. Danielle exhaled slowly. A few hours in first class, a glass of wine, and silence. That was all she wanted. She had no idea that before the night was over, she would have to fight for the seat she had rightfully paid for. The boarding area buzzed with the familiar rhythm of air travel. Muted conversations, the occasional chime of an incoming message, and the steady shuffle of feet over polished tile floors. Passengers of all kinds prepared to board Flight 1974 to San Francisco. A young couple whispered excitedly, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, eager for a long-anticipated getaway. A group of retirees in coordinated travel gear discussed their itinerary for Napa Valley. Their laughter soft contrast to more serious expressions of business travelers who paced near the charging stations, phone screens illuminated with last-minute emails. Near the priority boarding lane, a man in an impeccably tailored suit scrolled through his phone, his watch glinting under the terminal's fluorescent lighting, while a woman in a crisp blazer and low heels stood with her arms crossed, nodding along to an earpiece conversation. Across the way, a mother balanced a toddler on one hip, rummaging through a carry-on with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to wrangling both luggage and a restless child. When the gate agent finally announced first-class boarding, Danielle stepped forward with the practiced ease of a frequent flyer. Her polished black pumps clicked softly against the jet bridge as she made her way onto the aircraft, offering a polite nod to the flight attendant at the entrance. The familiar scent of leather seats and recirculated air filled the cabin, and for the first time in days, she felt the beginnings of relief. First class was sparsely filled, and she slid into her window seat 2A, carefully tucking her bag beneath the seat in front of her. Exhaling slowly, she allowed her shoulders to relax. She had no grand expectations, just a few hours of uninterrupted quiet, a glass of wine, and maybe even a short nap before landing. From the front of the cabin, Lisa Monroe observed the passengers with a sharp, assessing gaze. A veteran flight attendant in her mid-50s, Lisa carried herself with the rigid precision of someone who has spent decades enforcing order at 35,000 feet. Her uniform was immaculate, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, not a strand out of place. She had seen it all. VIPs who expected to be doted on, entitled travelers who treated her like an inconvenience, and the occasional unruly passenger who needed to be put in their place. But as she scanned the rows, her eyes lingered on Danielle for a beat too long, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly before she moved on. There was no reason to question the woman in 2A, and yet something about her made Lisa pause, as if a silent, unspoken assumption had already begun to take root. Lisa moved through the first-class cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this routine 1,000 times. A warm but measured smile sat on her face as she handed out pre-departure drinks, offering a choice of champagne, orange juice, or water. She placed a flute of bubbly in front of the man in 1C, a businessman who barely looked up from his phone. She turned to 2B and 2C, where Eleanor and Robert, the elderly couple, sat with their hands gently intertwined. "Would you like something to drink before takeoff?" she asked. Eleanor smiled, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Champagne, please." Robert nodded toward the water. Lisa retrieved their drinks promptly, her posture straight, her movements precise. She worked her way through the rows, pausing briefly at each seat, making light conversation, ensuring every passenger was accommodated, except for 2A. Danielle watched the flight attendant move past her, without so much as a glance in her direction. At first, she thought it was an oversight, a simple mistake. But as Lisa continued down the aisle, her tray still balanced perfectly in one hand, skipping only her, something inside her stiffened. Danielle had been on hundreds of flights, and she knew how the small things, the tone of a voice, the flicker of hesitation, the slight but deliberate omission, could reveal far more than words ever could. Eleanor noticed it, too. As Lisa moved on, she turned to Robert, her voice soft but edged with concern. Did she just... Robert, a retired professor with a sharp eye for details, gave a small nod. She skipped her. His eyes flicked toward Danielle, who sat with her back straight, her expression unreadable. Eleanor frowned, watching as Lisa poured a drink for the man in 3A, the one who had barely looked up from his laptop. "It's probably nothing," Robert murmured, sensing the way Eleanor's posture had shifted. But the look in her eyes said she wasn't so sure. Danielle exhaled slowly, choosing not to react. It wasn't worth it. Not yet. The slight had been subtle, and calling attention to it now would do nothing but paint her as difficult. She had dealt with moments like this before, where she had to weigh whether to push back or let it slide. Most of the time, she let it slide. She had spent years proving her worth in a world that often assumed she didn't belong. She had navigated boardrooms where people mistook her for an assistant, handled meetings where her voice was spoken over, and attended events where she was the only black woman in a sea of executives who did not look like her. If she responded to every minor slight, she'd be at war every day. She reached for the in-flight magazine, flipping through the pages with practiced indifference. It wasn't about the drink. It was about what the drink represented. A quiet dismissal, an assumption, a signal that even in first class, where she had paid the same as everyone else, she did not deserve the same attention. But she let it go. For now, still, the air had shifted. A tension had settled, unspoken but undeniable. A few rows behind, Tom Riley had picked up on it as well. He had seen Danielle board, had noticed her presence, Not because she stood out in any negative way, but because she carried herself with a quiet authority that commanded attention. When Lisa skipped her, he felt like an off-key note in a familiar melody, something that didn't sit right. He glanced at Danielle, who remained poised, and then at Lisa, who had resumed her service as if nothing had happened. Lisa, for a part, felt nothing unusual about her actions. She was simply doing her job, maintaining the order of the cabin, ensuring everything ran smoothly. She had been in the profession for over 2 decades. She knew people. She read passengers within seconds of meeting them. Who was entitled, who was anxious, who would complain, who expected special treatment. And sometimes, even if she wouldn't admit it aloud, she made snap judgments about who belonged. She finished the pre-departure service and returned to the galley, her tray now empty. It wasn't until she glanced back at the cabin that she caught sight of Danielle again. Their eyes met for the briefest moment before Lisa turned away, her shoulders straightening, her grip tightening around the handle of the beverage cart. Something about that woman in 2A unsettled her, though she couldn't quite place why. As the plane lifted off, the cabin settled into a familiar rhythm. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and passengers shifted in their seats, adjusting pillows, pulling out tablets, and making themselves comfortable for the journey ahead. The soft hum of conversation filled first class. As drinks were sipped, flight attendants moved methodically through their duties, and the world below became nothing but a stretch of clouds. Danielle leaned back, closing her eyes briefly, willing the exhaustion from the past few days to dissipate. She hadn't expected much from this flight. Only a few hours of peace before landing in San Francisco, but something in her gut told her that peace wasn't coming. Lisa stepped out from the galley, her posture rigid, her gaze sweeping over the passengers. She made her way down the aisle, her steps deliberate, until she stopped beside 2A. "Ma'am," she said, her tone professional but clipped. Danielle looked up, her expression neutral. "Yes." Lisa folded her hands in front of her, tilting her chin ever so slightly. "I need to see your boarding pass." The words were spoken with a practiced authority, the kind that expected instant compliance. Danielle blinked, momentarily thrown. She had flown first class countless times, and never, not once, had she been asked to produce her boarding pass mid-flight. Around her, passengers continued their quiet conversations, but few heads turned, sensing the unusual nature of the request. She met Lisa's eyes, searching for a reason, but found only a firm insistence. Without a word, she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and retrieved a slip of paper, holding it out between 2 fingers. Lisa took it without so much as a nod, unfolding it slowly, her eyes scanning the details as if expecting something to be amiss. She turned it over, then back again, her scrutiny lasting far longer than necessary. Danielle's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She was used to these moments, to the way certain people examine her presence with suspicion rather than acceptance. Lisa, oblivious to the way of the exchange, pursed her lips. "Just verifying," she said finally, handing it back with a tight smile. "Everything seems to be in order." Danielle accepted the pass, sliding it back into her pocket, never breaking eye contact. Lisa hesitated, as if considering saying something else, then turned on her heel and walked away. But the moment lingered, heavier than the turbulence beginning to stir outside. Danielle took a slow breath, feeling the tension settle deep in her chest. Something about Lisa's request didn't sit right. As an FAA director, she was well-versed in airline policies, including standard in-flight procedures, and this wasn't one of them. Boarding passes were checked at the gate and, in rare cases, before takeoff if there was confusion during seating. But mid-flight? That was unusual. It wasn't an innocent mistake or routine verification. It was something else. A subtle test. A silent challenge. Asterisk, the quiet insinuation that she had taken a seat she wasn't supposed to have. Danielle had faced these moments before. The questioning glances when she entered a boardroom. The hesitation from waitstaff in high-end restaurants before addressing her table. The brief flickers of doubt in a stranger's eyes when she handed over her credit card. They were never outright accusations, just small moments designed to remind her that she needed to prove she belonged. and she was always forced to make a decision. Asterisk, asterisk, call it out and risk being labeled difficult, or let it go and endure the quiet erosion of dignity. Asterisk, asterisk. She stared at the space where Lisa had just stood, fingers curling against the armrest. This wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. Across the aisle, Tom Riley had been watching. The 30-something tech entrepreneur had spent years analyzing patterns, reading people, spotting inconsistencies before anyone else did, and something about what he just witnessed didn't add up. He had been on enough flights to know how first class worked. He had never, not once, seen a flight attendant demand to see a boarding pass mid-flight. His fingers tapped lightly against the edge of his laptop, eyes narrowing as he studied Danielle. Her posture was controlled, composed, but the stiffness in her shoulders gave her way. She was holding herself back, choosing not to react, at least not yet. Tom shifted his gaze to Lisa, who had returned to the galley, her expression unreadable. A gut instinct told him that this wasn't the last time she would approach Danielle, and whatever was coming next wouldn't be subtle. Asterisk, asterisk. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as Lisa emerged from the galley with renewed purpose, her polished shoes tapping sharply against the carpeted aisle. Her expression had shifted. Asterisk, asterisk, no longer just professional detachment, but something harder, more decisive. Asterisk, asterisk, she stopped abruptly at 2A, standing over Danielle with an air of authority that demanded compliance. "Ma'am," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of first class. "I need to verify your ticket again." Danielle didn't move. Her fingers, resting lightly on the armrest, remained still as she lifted her gaze to meet Lisa's. "I already showed it to you," she replied evenly, keeping her tone measure controlled. Lisa's eyes flickered, but she didn't back down. "We had reported passengers from the main cabin taking seats in first class without authorization." A few nearby passengers turned their heads sharply at the words. Danielle exhaled slowly, the prickle of indignation spreading through her veins like a slow burn. There it was, the unspoken accusation finally spoken aloud. "That doesn't apply to me," she said, her voice unwavering. "I purchased this seat, and you know that." Lisa didn't budge. "I need to verify it with the gate agent." Danielle, clench your jaw. This wasn't about a ticket. This wasn't about procedure. This was about power, about making her justify her presence in a space where Lisa clearly thought she didn't belong. Asterisk, asterisk. A rustling sound broke the moment as Eleanor sat forward in her seat, her face twisted in disbelief. "We saw her boarding pass," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than before. "She was here before most of us even sat down." Lisa's eyes flicked to Eleanor, her expression tightening. "Ma'am, this is an airline matter." Robert, sitting beside his wife, shook his head. "It doesn't seem like an airline matter," he muttered under his breath. "It seems like harassment." A ripple of unease passed through the first-class cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they weren't witnessing something wrong. The man in one seat glanced over but quickly looked away, fixing his attention back on his phone. The woman in 3B folded her arms, exhaling in frustration, but stayed silent. Tom Riley, however, didn't look away. His spine went rigid, his eyes darkening as he closed his laptop with a soft snap. "Jesus," he murmured, shaking his head as he watched Lisa press forward with her demand. "I have checked, and there is no record of you being assigned to this seat," Lisa continued, her voice carrying to the cabin now, making it clear that this wasn't a quiet discussion anymore. It was a public display. Danielle knew exactly what this was. Humiliation as a tactic, a performance of authority, asterisk, asterisk. She leaned back slightly in her seat, eyes locked onto Lisa's with steady intensity. "I will not move," she said. "My name is Danielle Carter, FAA Director, and I suggest you check again." The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa straightened her posture, her jaw tight as she stared down at Danielle. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a blade. "Ma'am," she announced, her voice carrying to a first-class cabin so there was no mistaking her words. "If you do not comply, I will have no choice but to notify the authorities upon landing." The murmur of passengers shifted into stunned silence. A few heads turned fully toward a confrontation now, no longer pretending to ignore what was happening. Eleanor let out an audible gasp, shaking her head in disbelief. Robert whispered something under his breath that Danielle couldn't hear, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. Danielle felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin, some filled with concern, others with detached curiosity, and a few, those who hadn't said a word, with a kind of silent complicity that made moments like this possible. But she wouldn't be humiliated. Not today. Not ever. Lisa had drawn her battle lines, but Danielle had spent her career navigating power struggles. She had sat across from corporate executives who dismissed her ideas only to steal them later. She had walked into rooms full of men who questioned why she was there before realizing she was the one leading the meeting. She knew exactly what this was, and she wouldn't be bullied into submission. Her heartbeat remained steady as she folded her hands in her lap, lifting her chin ever so slightly. "I will not move," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "You have already checked my boarding pass twice. This is my assigned seat." Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but Danielle cut her off, her tone firm, sharp as steel. "I suggest you check again." The moment stretched unbearably long, the weight of Lisa's challenge pressing down on the cabin like turbulence before a storm. The hush that had settled was unnatural, thick with the unspoken expectations of power, race, and authority colliding in real time. Danielle felt it all, the scrutiny, the disbelief, the simmering tension hanging in the air, as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Lisa, standing over her, seemed to relish the moment, the unshakable confidence of someone used to getting their way. Danielle let the silence hang for just a second longer, then moved. With deliberate calm, she slid a hand inside her navy blazer, the smooth lining cool against her fingertips. She wasn't reaching for her boarding pass. Asterisk, asterisk. She was reaching for something far more powerful. Asterisk, asterisk. She pulled out a small, sleek black case and flipped it open. The gold of her FAA director's badge gleamed under the cabin lights, bold, official, undeniable. The laminated ID beneath it bore her full name, Danielle Carter, along with her title and the unmistakable seal of the Federal Aviation Administration. Lisa's eyes flickered to the badge, her smug expression dissolving in real time. The shift was so sudden, so complete, that for a split second, she looked like she might physically step backward. The color drained from her face, her lips parting slightly in shock. A collective inhale rippled through the cabin. Gasps, murmurs, the rustling of clothes as passengers sat up straighter in their seats. Someone in row 3 whispered a hushed, "Oh my God." Another voice muttered, "Wait, she's FAA?" The sudden crack in Lisa's authority was palpable, undeniable. Her fingers twitched at her sides, as if unsure whether to retreat or double down. Danielle could see the gears turning in her head, the scramble for an exit strategy she no longer had. Tom Riley, still watching intently, let out a low whistle under his breath. His eyes flicked from Lisa to Danielle, then back to Lisa, his expression a mix of amusement and the deep satisfaction of someone witnessing a long-overdue reckoning. Eleanor, sitting just across the aisle, smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. Robert exhaled a quiet, "Well, damn." Lisa, visibly struggling to regain control, cleared her throat, forcing her shoulders straight. Danielle cut her off. "My name is Danielle Carter," she said, her voice cool and unshaken, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "I am a director at the Federal Aviation Administration. If you had bothered to check your passenger list properly, you would have seen that I purchased this first-class ticket weeks ago." Lisa swallowed hard. "You are in direct violation of passenger rights and federal anti-discrimination regulations," Danielle continued, her tone edged with sharp authority that brokered no argument. "Your repeated insistence that I am not supposed to be here, asterisk, asterisk, despite already verifying my ticket twice, asterisk, asterisk, is not only inappropriate, it is actionable." Lisa's throat bobbed. She looked around as if searching for an escape, but there wasn't one. The entire first-class cabin had just witnessed her unraveling in real time. Lisa's entire demeanor had changed. The unwavering confidence she had displayed a moment ago had shattered, replaced by something more fragile, more uncertain. Her feet hesitated before moving, as if she were caught in some internal battle, trying to decide whether to fight or flee. Finally, She took a stiff step back, then another, her arms still tense at her sides. Without another word, she turned and strode quickly toward the galley, the sharp click of her heels muffled by the carpet. The moment she disappeared behind the curtain, she gripped the counter with both hands, her knuckles turning white. Her pulse was erratic. The way the woman, Danielle Carter, FAA director of all people, had looked at her, spoken to her, completely stripped her control. Lisa had spent decades perfecting the balance of customer service and authority, knowing exactly when to push and when to pull back. But she had pushed the wrong person this time. She stared blankly at the coffee pot in front of her, her mind racing. Her ears buzzed with the faint murmurs of the passengers behind her, their conversations picking up now that she was out of sight. She had been so sure, so convinced she had been right to question the woman's seat. But that badge, the golden FAA emblem, the laminated ID beneath it, the steel confidence in Danielle's voice, made it clear that she had miscalculated, badly. In the first-class cabin, the tension remained thick, but the energy had shifted. A new kind of curiosity and disbelief crackled in the air. Passengers began leaning toward one another, whispering in hushed but urgent tones. I knew something was off the moment she kept pressing her, Robert muttered to Eleanor. If she had really been following protocol, she wouldn't have panicked like that. Eleanor nodded, her face still tight with frustration. She was looking for a reason. You could see it in her face. A woman a few rows back shook her head. It's disgusting. She assumed Danielle didn't belong. Then when she realized she was wrong, she crumbled. A younger man in 1C, who had kept his head down until now, spoke quietly to himself. Man, she knew she messed up the second she saw that badge. The way it would have just unfolded was settling in, and for many, it left a bad taste. People had witnessed discrimination before, asterisk in hotels, in restaurants, in high-end stores where assumptions replaced facts. Asterisk, but this was blatant. This was public. And this time, it had happened to someone with power. Asterisk. Tom Riley had been silent through most of the exchange, but his fingers twitched against the smooth surface of his laptop. This was too big to ignore. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and began typing. Asterisk just watched a flight attendant on my Delta flight publicly challenge a black woman's right to sit in first class. This woman calmly stood her ground, and when the FAA wouldn't back off, she pulled out a badge. Turns out she's an FAA director. The FAA damn near turned white. Asterisk. He hesitated for half a second, then added, racism at 35,000 feet is still racism. Then he hit send. He had no idea the firestorm he had just unleashed. Lisa inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself as she reached for the intercom phone in the galley. Her fingers trembled slightly as she punched in the code to connect with the cockpit. She needed to regain control of the situation. The line clicked, and after a beat, the captain's voice came through, calm and measured. This is Captain Reynolds. Lisa swallowed hard. Captain, we have a situation in first class, she said, her voice lower than usual, careful to keep it from carrying beyond the thin curtains separating her from the passengers. There was a pause. What kind of situation? Lisa hesitated. How was she supposed to explain this? That she had publicly accused a high-ranking FAA official of stealing a first-class seat? That she had demanded to see her boarding pass not once, not twice, but 3 times? That she had practically threatened to have her removed, only to be humiliated when the woman flashed an identification badge that carried more weight than anything Lisa could counter with? Her mouth felt dry. There's a passenger in 2A, she started, choosing her words carefully, deliberately. I had reason to believe she was in the wrong seat. The captain's voice remained neutral. Had reason? Lisa cleared her throat. I asked her for a boarding pass. She showed it to me, but She stopped, realizing how flimsy the explanation sounded even to herself. I asked again to verify with the gate agent, but she refused to move. The line was silent for a moment, then a low exhale. Lisa, are you saying this passenger refused to follow a direct instruction, or are you saying you might have made an error? Lisa's stomach twisted at the question. She had never been questioned like this before. She had always been the one in control, the one whose authority was respected. But this wasn't a standard passenger. This wasn't someone who could be dismissed with an excuse about airline policy. She showed me an ID, Lisa admitted finally, her voice quieter now. What kind of ID? Lisa squeezed her eyes shut. An FAA badge. The silence stretched long and thick. When the captain finally spoke again, his voice had changed. You're telling me you challenge an FAA director's right to be in first class? His tone wasn't angry. Asterisk, asterisk, just laced with the sharp incredulity of someone who knew how serious a mistake had just been made. Asterisk, asterisk. Lisa's grip on the phone tightened. I didn't realize who she was. Clearly. Lisa's breath came faster, her mind scrambling for a way to salvage what was left of her credibility. What do you want me to do? She asked, though she already knew the answer. You need to de-escalate. Immediately. The captain's voice was clipped, final. And for your sake, Lisa, I hope this doesn't go any further than already has. Lisa nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Understood. She hung up the phone, but the knot in her stomach didn't ease. She had lost this fight, and now, all she could do was try to contain the damage before it spread beyond the confines of the cabin. But it was already too late. The cabin remained thick with tension, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on the passengers like an invisible force. Then, the intercom crackled to life, breaking through the uneasy silence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking, came the calm, measured voice from the flight deck. We've been made aware of a situation in the first-class cabin. I want to assure everyone that the matter is being addressed, and we appreciate your cooperation as we continue our flight to San Francisco. A ripple of murmurs passed through the cabin. The message was short, controlled, asterisk, asterisk, but the meaning behind it was clear. Asterisk, asterisk, the captain wasn't just informing the passengers. He was signaling to Lisa that she had gone too far and that the situation was now out of her hands. Danielle remained perfectly still in her seat, but inside, her instincts were in overdrive. She had spent years in regulatory meetings, listening to airline representatives maneuver around liability issues, crafting language that could diffuse accountability while still appearing responsible. The captain's announcement hadn't been for her benefit. It had been a message for Lisa, a warning. Danielle's fingers traced the edge of her armrest as she took in the shifting dynamics around her. Lisa had made a call, likely trying to cover herself before this spiraled any further. But the moment that badge had come out, she had lost control of the narrative. This wasn't just a flight attendant dealing with a difficult passenger. This was a flight attendant who had just singled out a federal aviation official, humiliated her, and now had to answer for it. Eleanor turned in her seat, her voice barely above a whisper. She's trying to save herself. Danielle glanced at the older woman, meeting her sharp gaze. She nodded once. She is... Lisa was backed into a corner, and Danielle knew exactly what happened when people like her felt their power slipping. They didn't apologize out of regret. They apologized out of fear. Across the aisle, Tom Riley leaned back, watching everything unfold like a man who had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger than anyone here realized. He tapped his phone screen, checking engagement on his post. It was climbing. Fast. Asterisk, asterisk. Lisa hadn't just humiliated the wrong person. She had picked a fight with someone who could change the very rules she was supposed to follow. The wheels touched down at San Francisco International Airport with a smooth but decisive thud. The usual routine followed. The slight jolt as the aircraft slowed, the ding of the seatbelt sign turning off, the shuffle of passengers reaching for overhead bins. But for Danielle, there was nothing routine about this landing. She expected a resolution, but something felt off. Lisa had disappeared into the galley after the captain's announcement, not daring to make another approach. The rest of the flight had passed in an unsettling silence. First-class passengers exchanging glances, but keeping their conversations to whispers. Danielle felt a shift in the air. Asterisk, asterisk, the way people hesitated to meet her gaze. The unspoken understanding that they had just witnessed something bigger than a simple in-flight dispute. Asterisk, asterisk. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Danielle saw Lisa reappear briefly, her movements tense, eyes fixed straight ahead. She no longer exuded the confidence she had at the beginning of the flight. Instead, she looked like someone walking a tightrope, waiting to see which way she would fall. Danielle remained seated as passengers began to file out, making no effort to rush. She knew someone would be waiting for her the moment she stepped off the jet bridge, and she was prepared to address this directly. When she exited the aircraft, the airport's cool, conditioned air wrapped around her, a sharp contrast to the heated tension on board. Standing just past the gate was a woman in a navy blue airline blazer, her ID badge clipped neatly to the lapel. Chelsea Brooks, the on-duty supervisor. Danielle had dealt with people like her before. The corporate buffer, the damage control specialist, the one sent in to handle problems before they escalated further. Ms. Carter. Chelsea greeted her with a polite but guarded smile. I'm Chelsea Brooks, the customer service supervisor for this flight. Do you have a moment to speak privately? Danielle took her in, reading her just as she had read Lisa. Chelsea was trained for moments like this. The airline had likely briefed her while the plane was still in the air, preparing her for exactly how much she could and couldn't say. Of course, Danielle said smoothly, though she already knew what was coming. Chelsea led her to a quiet seating area near the gate, away from the crowds of passengers reuniting with family or checking departure boards. She gestured for Danielle to sit, then took a seat across from her, her hands folded in a way that was meant to look open but was really about control. First, I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred on board, Chelsea began, her voice even, practiced. We take customer service very seriously, and we want to ensure that every passenger has a comfortable and respectful experience while flying with us. Danielle arched a brow. The words were smooth, diplomatic, but they weren't an apology. She let Chelsea speak, watching as she carefully navigated around the issue, acknowledging that there was a situation but never actually admitting fault. We've already begun reviewing the incident internally, Chelsea continued. We understand that tensions arose during the flight, and we appreciate your patience as we work to address any concerns. Danielle exhaled slowly, her fingers pressing against the armrest of her chair. They were trying to bury it. It wasn't just the way Chelsea spoke. It was a deliberate vagueness, the careful omission of key details. There was no mention of Lisa's behavior, no acknowledgement that Danielle had been repeatedly challenged despite showing her boarding pass, no admission that an FAA director had been publicly humiliated. This wasn't about accountability. It was about containment. Danielle's lips pressed together, her patience wearing thin. I appreciate you reaching out, Chelsea, she said, keeping her tone professional but pointed. But let's be clear, this wasn't a misunderstanding. Your flight attendant repeatedly questioned my right to be in my assigned seat, despite verifying my ticket twice. She escalated the situation in front of the entire cabin, and when I stood my ground, she threatened to involve the authorities. Chelsea's expression barely flickered, but Danielle caught the way her shoulders tensed ever so slightly. She hadn't expected pushback. Not this soon, not this directly. Danielle leaned forward slightly. And let's not forget that when I presented my FAA badge, she panicked. That tells me she knew she was in the wrong from the start. Chelsea hesitated, the first real crack in her composure. Ms. Carter, I understand your frustration, and I assure you that we're taking this matter seriously. Are you? Danielle interrupted, her voice cool but firm. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like the airline is trying to contain an incident rather than address it. Chelsea's silence was telling. Danielle had seen this playbook before. She had been in rooms where executives whisper about optics, where problems were assessed based on how much media attention they would attract rather than whether they were right or wrong. This wasn't about justice. This was about damage control. She took a measured breath, her decision already made. I'll be filing a formal complaint, she stated, leaving no room for argument. Chelsea straightened, nodding once, her expression unreadable. Of course, we'll fully cooperate with any review process. Danielle held her gaze for a moment longer before standing, her posture unwavering. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Danielle left the small seating area with a sense of quiet resolve, but the weight of what had just transpired sat heavily on her shoulders. As she walked through the terminal, the lingering unease from the conversation with Chelsea clung to her. She had hoped for a genuine apology, for some acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done to her, but instead, she had been met with carefully worded avoidance, a corporate play to minimize the situation and move on as quickly as possible. But Danielle wasn't about to let that happen. She had spent years fighting for fairness and accountability in the aviation industry. But this wasn't just about her. It was about every passenger who had ever been mistreated. Every person who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. She couldn't let this moment slide, not when it was clear that the airline was trying to sweep it under the rug. As soon as she reached her hotel room, she pulled out her phone and began typing. She'd been preparing for this since she left the plane, the words already forming in her mind. It wasn't just about lodging a complaint. It was about making sure the right people understood the gravity of the situation. Danielle composed a formal, detailed letter, outlining everything that had transpired on the flight. The repeated questioning of her seat, the public humiliation in front of other passengers, the unwarranted threats made by the flight attendant. She made sure to include all the key details, noting the emotional toll it had taken on her and the need for proper training to prevent future incidents. Once she hit send, she felt a sense of definitive closure, but there was something else lingering, the feeling that this was far from over. Danielle knew that filing a formal complaint wasn't enough. She needed to make sure the airline took real action, that this didn't become just another file in the customer service incident pile. Meanwhile, Tom Riley's phone buzzed constantly, the notifications practically cascading down his screen. After he posted about the incident, he had no idea the storm it would create. His tweet had been simple, just a few lines of text about witnessing the flight attendant's treatment of a black passenger, how the woman had stood her ground with quiet authority, and how the flight attendant had cracked under the pressure when the FAA badge was revealed. But that tweet, asterisk those few lines, hit a nerve. Asterisk it was shared across multiple platforms, picked up by journalists, activists, and ordinary users who were outraged by what had happened. Within hours, his post had racked up thousands of retweets and started picking up media attention. News outlets, bloggers, and social commentators were now running with the story, framing it as another instance of racism and power abuse in air travel. The reactions were swift and unrelenting. People had questions. People were demanding answers from the airline, from a flight crew, from anyone who had been involved. The post had become a lightning rod for a much larger conversation about how black passengers were treated in public spaces and how unchecked authority led to humiliation and systemic abuse. By the time Tom went to bed that night, his phone had exploded with messages. Reporters from major outlets had reached out, wanting details. Other passengers who had been on the flight shared their stories, some of them admitting they had been too scared to speak up at the time. But now, emboldened by the viral attention, they were ready to add their voices to the growing chorus. The conversation was no longer just a personal grievance. It had become a movement, a moment when a single flight had exposed the deep, systemic issues that still lingered in air travel. Tom, still in shock at the sudden attention, realized that his tweet had become more than he'd ever intended. What had started as a simple observation had turned into something much bigger, and now everyone was watching. The next morning, as the first light of dawn spilled to the curtains of her hotel room, Danielle's phone buzzed relentlessly. She had barely had a chance to check the news when a string of emails and messages began flooding in. The airline had been forced to act. It started with an official statement from Delta Airlines, a carefully crafted apology that was almost too smooth in its attempt to downplay the situation. But behind the corporate language, one thing stood out. Lisa Monroe, the flight attendant who had escalated the situation, had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The airline could no longer ignore the pressure from social media, from public outrage, and from mounting calls for accountability. Danielle felt a knot loosen in her chest. This was a small victory. It wasn't much, just one person temporarily removed from her position, but it was a start. The incident had exposed how deeply ingrained the biases were, not just in isolated incidents, but within the very systems designed to maintain order. Now it was being addressed. But Danielle knew the fight wasn't over. She had always understood that change didn't come from one small gesture. The real work was just beginning, and she knew she would have to stay involved if this moment was going to mean something beyond a public apology and a few disciplinary actions. Later that afternoon, she received a call from Chelsea Brooks. the customer service supervisor who had tried to smooth over the situation after landing. Chelsea was far more apologetic this time, her voice sincere, though tinged with regret. "We are committed to learning from this, Ms. Carter," she said. "And as part of our commitment, we'd like to invite you to consult on inclusivity and bias training for our staff." Danielle paused for a moment. She hadn't expected this kind of follow-up, but it was a direct opportunity to influence change from the inside. "I'll need to see real action," she replied, her tone resolute, "but I'm willing to help." The invitation to consult wasn't just a token gesture. It was a recognition that things had to change, and Danielle could be part of shaping that change. A few days later, Danielle stood at the podium at the International Aviation Safety Conference, her gaze sweeping over the audience of airline executives, safety officers, and industry professionals. The conference was being held at a sprawling convention center in downtown Los Angeles, and the room was packed with some of the most influential people in aviation. As the keynote speaker, Danielle was expected to speak about regulatory measures and aviation safety, but she had something far more important to address. The microphone hummed with feedback as she adjusted the stand. She took a deep breath, her heart still steady despite the weight of the moment. The story of her flight had gone viral, and now she had the attention of an entire industry. She could have easily turned this moment into a lecture on rules and regulations, but instead, she chose to speak to something much more fundamental: the dignity of every passenger who steps onto a plane. "When we talk about safety in aviation," Danielle began, her voice carrying the back of the room, "we must remember that it's not just about the mechanical systems, the flight crews, or the regulations. It's about the people. Every single person who board a plane is entrusting us with their safety, but more than that, they're trusting us with their human dignity." She paused, letting her words sink in. The events that unfolded on that flight were not just about a seat in first class or an administrative error. They were about systemic failure to recognize that every passenger, regardless of race, gender, or background, deserves to be treated with respect. Danielle's eyes scanned the crowd, watching as some of the executives shifted in their seats. Others took notes. "We cannot sit back and ignore these issues. If we do, we perpetuate a cycle of discrimination and bias that erodes the very trust passengers place in us. We need to fix it, not just in theory, but in practice. The real change starts with us." Her words hung in the air, a challenge, a call to action. The room was still, the audience fully engaged. For the first time in her career, Danielle felt like she was truly being heard. After the speech, she was approached by several Delta executives, including Martin Green, the Senior Vice President of Customer Relations. He was a tall man in a crisp suit, his face serious as he shook her hand. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice sincere, "on behalf of Delta Airlines, I want to personally apologize for what happened to you. We are committed to addressing the issues of bias and discrimination in our company, and we want to make sure that something like this never happens again." Danielle nodded, but her gaze didn't waver. Words are just that, asterisk, asterisk, words, asterisk, asterisk. What matters is what you do next. "We understand," Martin said, his eyes meeting hers. "We're already rolling out industry-wide changes to ensure all of our staff receives mandatory inclusivity training. We've already begun reviewing the incident internally, and Lisa Monroe, the flight attendant involved, is on administrative leave while we conduct a thorough investigation. We'll be implementing new training programs, reviewing our policies on customer service, and making sure this issue is addressed head-on." Danielle listened carefully. Action spoke louder than any apology, but it was a start. "I'm glad to hear it," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Make sure it's more than just a temporary fix. Make it a part of your culture. Asterisk, asterisk, not just a training, but the mindset that every passenger's dignity is worth protecting. Asterisk, asterisk." Martin nodded. "We will. I promise you." As the conference continued, Danielle found herself drifting away from the crowd, her mind processing the weight of what had just transpired. The speech, the conversations, the promises made, it all felt like a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire industry. She could still hear the echo of her words, the challenge she had issued to everyone in that room. It wasn't just about the incident on Flight 1974, not anymore. It was about something much bigger. She leaned against the window of her hotel room, looking out at the sprawling city lights of Los Angeles. The city felt vast, and yet, in this moment, Danielle couldn't help but think of how small the world had become, how connected everything was, how one moment, one confrontation at 35,000 feet, could trigger such far-reaching ripples. Her role in the FAA had always been about the technical side of aviation, asterisk regulations, safety measures, industry standards, asterisk, but this fight was personal. It was about ensuring that every person, whether they were a CEO, a flight attendant, or a passenger, was treated with dignity and respect. It was about ensuring that the aviation industry didn't just operate smoothly, but that it reflected the values of fairness and equality. As the stories continued to pour in, as the pressure from the media and the public mounted, Danielle realized the magnitude of the change she had sparked. She had no illusions about how hard this would be, how deeply rooted bias and systemic issues were within the industry. It wouldn't be solved overnight, but what mattered was that people were finally paying attention. The conversations had shifted. The status quo was being questioned. The incident had opened a door to change, to progress. And though it had started with one flight, it had the potential to shift the very fabric of how airlines operated. This wasn't just about holding one person accountable. It was about ensuring that every person who boarded a plane was treated with fairness, respect, and humanity. Danielle knew the road ahead would be long and the battle would continue. But in that moment, as she looked out over the city, she felt a quiet satisfaction. This was just the beginning. The industry was changing, and she was part of making it happen. As Danielle sat quietly in her hotel room, reflecting on the journey she had just begun, she couldn't help but wonder about the countless others who had witnessed injustice in silence, whether it was on a plane, in the workplace, or in their everyday lives. How many times had people seen something wrong and chosen not to speak up? She knew the truth. It was easy to stay quiet, to avoid confrontation, to let someone else deal with the problem. But in doing so, we let the cycle of disrespect and discrimination continue. Now, more than ever, she realized that silence was complicity. The moment she stood her ground and chose to speak out was the moment things started to change. But what if others had spoken up sooner? What if those who witnessed the injustice in the cabin had stood with her, had raised their voices when Lisa first questioned her ticket? Danielle's experience had shown her that change doesn't always start with a big, sweeping movement. Sometimes it starts with one voice, one person refusing to be silent in the face of wrongdoing. So ask yourself, have you ever witnessed injustice and stayed silent? Would you act differently if you saw it today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start the conversation. Asterisk, the fight for justice is far from over, but together we can create the change we want to see.